So here we are, another Rippaverse release, Bloodruth. They released it back around Halloween, I believe, and we are finally getting the books. And this is like another kind of prequel within the Rippaverse. So Bloodruth was initially thrown into Isom number 2, and I really like Isom number 2, and we got Isom number 3 now on the way too. So we're gonna see how that story wraps up for Bloodruth and Isom. But we're kind of getting like a very like small prequel for Bloodruth, so it's not like a full-blown like years before an early part of her story. A little bit is, but it's more like set shortly before Isom number 2, before Isom goes and sees her. It kind of sets up her place in kind of where we saw her in Isom 2 in a way. But this is a slight prequel to Isom number 2, so it is set before. So you could read this before and then read Isom 2, and it would kind of make sense to where she is. But this is not going to be a spoiler review, as these usually are. It's pretty early on. People are only getting the books now. But I can kind of give my general thoughts of the book, of course, and how I feel about it. This is, of course, by Jen and Sylvia Soska, who did Yaira as well, and they're doing multiple different books in the Rippaverse, so cool to see that. And I think of the few books that they have now actually had released, I think Bloodruth is definitely my favorite. I think of the two, I believe, so far, of Yaira and Bloodruth. I think Bloodruth, I think I personally just like the feeling of the horror type of, elements and the looks of certain characters and just the entire vibe of the book. I like the vibe a little more. I just like the feeling of a little darker than Yaira. Yaira is cool. We're still kind of got to see where that story goes. The plot is pretty simple for this. I mean, simple in terms of like the general plot of what's happening in the book. Now we get little sprinkles of what her story is and who she is and what her story will kind of look like and become as the story goes forward with the different issues of Bloodruth. But we're only kind of setting the groundwork now for this character because this is like her first full issue. This is her first full story with her. We're only just getting started. It's basically like an investigation almost type of story. She goes and helps out some people and deals with some of their issues. It's almost like she's helping some people out, working for them, and just doing some work for people. That's kind of what the story is. But again, we do get sprinkles of her story and who she is and what she is, her bloodline and her family and everything. We get little hints of what happened there with different characters and, what she deals with, who she fights, and the type of world that she is involved in. It's very different than Isom and like the superhero floor spark type of feeling that we're getting with like Alpha Core and Isom and Gooding even, who is in this book, by the way. Gooding it's not really, I wouldn't say it's much of a surprise to see Gooding in this story because Gooding is who introduced Isom to Bloodruth. But Gooding is in this book as well. And Gooding is probably the only one in this book who feels a little off. Not because he's like a bad character or anything, but him being in it is very weird because he's such a different feeling character than really everything else in this book, because it's such a darker book and the characters and that are involved in it, he doesn't fit. He feels kind of like he's just like a different type of character, it is weird for him of all people to be involved in it. But he is one of the first like characters that she introduces and is introduced to and meets in Floor Spark. We kind of knew that already with Isom. Now in this book, we do get to see her powers a little more. We already saw it in Isom number 2, where she's got this blood power, obviously given her name and her family name, Bloodruth. She's using like her blood or just blood to use like her abilities and her witch-like whatever abilities that she does, and we get to see her use that ability a little more in this to fight some villainous creatures and whatnot. And I thought it was really interesting. It's fascinating to see how her powers, there's limits. It seems to be quite a limit to what she can do with her powers. It's not like it's weak. It also feels like it needs to be used like whenever it really needs to be used. You can't just like use it willingly. You need to use it when you really need to. At least this specific ability that we've continued to see her use, with like the the energy, like the blood like energy coming from her fingers and stuff. It seems like you need to use it when you really need to. You can't just use it whenever, like willingly like a superhero or whatnot. You need to use it when you can. So we did get a little bit more of that for her in this as well. So it's not like just a crazy power she could just shoot out whenever she wants. It really seems like it puts a strain on her. You get to see strengths with her, but it is also limitations. You got lots of limitations for her, at least at this point in her story. Who knows what will happen going forward, and she'll evolve in some way. But at this point in the story, like her, you could see her limitations in this book, and I thought that was kind of a cool thing to kind of establish and know, like, okay, this is kind of what happens now when she uses her powers. Now, a pretty big part of the book is, or at least a big chunk of it, within the story, ingrained in the story, is like religious type stuff, and got no issue with that. I think it's fine. It works really well for lots of great stories. I'm not really that religious of a person, so I just don't really like connect to it all that much, but it is like pretty ingrained in her story and kind of who she is in her story and her family and what she is, you know. It's really heavily ingrained, and you know, within the religion type stuff, you know, you got to see some characters that did appear in Yaira #1 as well, so we got like little cameos from there as well. But religion is definitely seemingly a big part of Sydney Bloodruth's character, and I'm expecting to see that more going forward. But it really wasn't like anything I felt too attached to, because I'm not against any religion type stuff. I'm just not all that religious, and I don't feel much for it. But that can be added in the stories, and it can create, because religion is such a heavily touched on subject in so many different things in media, and it can be done really, really well. And I think it's been doing it's pretty interesting so far in this, for sure. I just really like to see the monsters and the horror type of stuff, the fighting in this book, and we do get quite a bit of that as well. But it is a pretty heavily, so at least in this first book, it's a pretty heavy part of her story is the religious type of aspect to her family and what she is and her bloodline and all that type of stuff. It is part of the story. So we did get the appearance of Gooding, which is not that surprising. But if you don't want to know the other two, there are two characters from previous Rippaverse books who do appear in this again pretty significantly. If you don't want to know that, I guess I would say spoiler warning here, even though I'm not going to tell you what happens. I'm not going to say what's happening in the book. We do get to see two returning characters, and it is Lillian and Michael, my two favorite villains from Alpha Core, and they've been appearing now throughout different Rippaverse books. They were in Isom 1, I believe. They're obviously in Alpha Core. They were in Horseman, I believe. So they are continuing to appear, and they're almost like the new Alpha Core. They're also everywhere, just like Alpha Core. I really like that. I'm super intrigued of the characters and the villains of Lillian and Michael, and to be honest, you know, they're in this book and they got a big part of the plot, but there's not really like much revealed about them really in this book. They're still really mysterious. We don't necessarily know their grand plan, and I would say the biggest part they've had so far still is in Alpha Core #1. So we don't really know where they're going to go from here. Again, this is before, I think it's before Alpha Core and all that stuff. So I don't know exactly where this places them in the story, because I know at the end of Alpha Core, they were kind of, you know, stopped a little bit by Alpha Core, but they weren't totally stopped. You know, they were kind of left in a limbo there. We don't really know where their story was going to go, so I don't exactly know where their story is here when it comes to that. But Lily and Michael do appear in this again, do actually play a pretty big part of the story, and I thought that was awesome, because I'm really starting to find a fascination for these two characters, and I know we're going to get some books from them going into this year. I'm quite looking forward to that, especially Michael Copper. You know, I like these two villains. They're both really interesting looking, but Michael Copper, I don't know what it is. This dude seems really, really fascinating, and I'm curious to see what he is all about. I don't know why. I just got that weird feeling about that character, and they're just very mysterious, and I'm curious to know much more about them. But yeah, as I have said, I do like this more than Yaira #1. It's the one I can compare with like the Soskas so far, Soska Sisters that I've done a few books now in the Rippaverse. They're going to do lots more, of course, as we know if you're following it. But these are the first kind of like few books that they've now had out, and I like the vibe of Bloodruth a little more. I just like the horror elements. I like the feeling of the dark feeling. These characters, this like mysterious dark world that they're kind of putting Sydney Bloodruth into, rather than like it's not. Yaira's more, I wouldn't say upbeat. It's almost more like fantasy, like mystical like type of stuff. You know, it's a little bigger and grander, superhero-y in a way. Bloodruth is a lot more like, I don't know, it's a lot more contained into her specific history and her story and her following her singular journey, at least as of so far in this book. I don't know. I think Bloodruth is a much more interesting book so far. I did like Yaira, but if I'm gonna have to choose, which I just want to say it, I'm gonna choose Bloodruth so far, but I am looking forward to Yaira 2 as well, and of course Bloodruth number 2. But that's kind of my spoiler-free feelings of Bloodruth. I thought it was pretty good, actually, and I am definitely looking forward to seeing where, you know, Bloodruth's story goes with Isom number 3 as well, because we have that to come out as well. So it is interesting that we have this, and now with Isom 3, it's going to continue a little bit more because she's literally with Avery in Isom number 3 there, and they're literally fighting those like creatures or whatever. So we'll see how that goes. And of course, we're doing more Bloodruth, so we'll get more of the story there. I don't know how far and how long we're gonna stay in this like before Isom period before we move on. Maybe the next one will go on, you know, past Isom. I'm not too sure, but I thought it was pretty good entry to the character. I wouldn't say it's like the greatest book I have ever read, but again, it's almost like just, you know, it's pretty typical now of these first books for the characters where they're still trying to introduce you to who they are. Like you still have to know who they are, because in Isom, you know, you only got a glimpse. Now we're starting to really get into who is this person even to begin with. So that's kind of what the story is, and we got some cool cameos from other Rippaverse characters as well, and I thought it was pretty fun, and I'm curious to see where her story goes next.